There is a memory stored somewhere in your nervous system that does not have a timestamp on it. It does not say, this happened in 1994 or 2008 or last year. It does not say, this is in the past. It does not even say, this is a memory. It simply exists as sensation, as a tightening in the chest when certain sounds occur, as a flooding of the stomach when a particular tone of voice enters the room, as the inexplicable need to leave places that feel like other places you needed to leave before, as a wariness that you cannot explain to yourself, let alone to anyone else, that lives in the body the way weather lives in an old joint, announcing itself before you are consciously aware of what it is announcing. This is trauma, not the dramatic clinical category that movies have made it. The quiet, lodged, biological residue of an experience that was too much for the nervous system to process at the time it happened. And I want to talk to you about it today with the full weight of two things that have, for too long, been kept in separate rooms. The neuroscience of what trauma actually does to the brain, and the scripture that was written about it centuries before we had the instruments to see what we now know. Because both of them are saying the same thing, and when you hear what they are each saying, I believe something in you is going to recognize it. Not as new information, as something you have always known but never had the language for. Let me start with a distinction that changes everything. Neuroscience divides memory into two broad categories. The first is explicit memory, declarative, conscious, narrative. It is the memory that knows it is a memory. You can call it to mind, put it in sequence, say, this happened, and then this happened, and then it ended. Explicit memory lives in a part of the brain called the hippocampus, and it comes with built-in temporal tagging, a sense of pastness, of distance, of this was then and this is now, the sis and now. The second kind is implicit memory. It is older, deeper, faster, and it carries no timestamp at all. Implicit memory is procedural. It is how you know how to ride a bicycle without thinking about it, but it is also emotional and somatic. It is how your body knows to flinch before your conscious mind has identified what it is flinching from. Implicit memory has no narrative, no beginning, middle, and end. It is simply, this is what happens when this occurs, when trauma happens, when an experience overwhelms the nervous system's capacity to process and integrate. The explicit memory system frequently fails to fully encode the event. The hippocampus goes partially offline during extreme stress. The narrative, the story that would give the event its pastness, does not form correctly. And so the implicit memory persists without the explicit memory to contextualize it, to timestamp it, to mark it as finished, which is why trauma survivors often cannot tell you exactly what happened. Not because they are hiding it, because the brain did not store it in the place where stories live. Pause. The body stored it in tissue, in reflex, in the 10,000 tiny adjustments the nervous system makes before the conscious mind is ever consulted. You are not crazy. You are not weak. You are not failing in your faith because you cannot simply decide to be over something. Your hippocampus is doing exactly what hippocampuses do when they are overwhelmed. Your amygdala is doing exactly what amygdalas do when they have recorded a pattern and are trying to protect you from it repeating. This is not a character flaw. This is survival biology. In the 1990s, a psychiatrist named Bessel van der Kolk published research that would eventually become one of the most important books on trauma ever written. The title is the thesis. The body keeps the score. What van der Kolk demonstrated across decades of clinical work and neuroimaging studies is that trauma is not stored primarily in the prefrontal cortex, the place of thought and narrative and meaning making. It is stored in the brainstem, in the limbic system, in the somatic landscape of the body itself. And because of that, because it is stored where it is stored, talking about it is not always enough to release it. Thinking about it differently is not always enough. Deciding to move on is not always enough. Because the body does not speak the language of decision. Pause. The body speaks the language of sensation, of presence, of safety, or the absence of it. And this is where I want to introduce you to Stephen Porges and the Polyvagal Theory. Porges identified 3 distinct states of the autonomic nervous system, 3 physiological modes the body moves between in response to perceived threat or safety. The first is the ventral vagal state. When you are in this state, your face is expressive, your voice carries warmth, your listening is genuine. This is the state of the person who sits across from someone they love and is fully there. The second is the sympathetic state. Fight or flight, mobilization, heart rate up, muscles ready, attention narrowed to the threat. The third, and this is the discovery that changed everything, is the dorsal vagal state. This is the oldest state evolutionarily, for freeze response. Immobility, the state of a person where the body is present, but the person is somehow absent. Porges discovered that many trauma survivors spend much of their lives oscillating between these last 2 states, between the alarm that will not turn off and the numbness that turns everything off. And what he found about how the nervous system moves back to the ventral state, to genuine presence, genuine connection, genuine life, requires the felt experience of safety in the context of another person, not information, not even the understanding that you are safe. The felt, physiological, relational experience of being safe with someone who is genuinely present. And now I want to show you something in Psalm 22 that has been there the entire time. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? Most Christians read this psalm and immediately jumped to its fulfillment, Jesus quoting it from the cross. But before it is a prophecy, it is a human being in the dorsal vagal state. It is a person in shutdown, the felt experience, not the theological fact, not the doctrinal truth, the felt experience of abandonment. I am a worm and not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by the people. This is what trauma sounds like. This is the voice of a nervous system that has been overwhelmed. that has gone into protective shutdown, that can no longer access the frontal lobe's capacity for hope and reframing. This is David, the man after God's own heart, in the neurological state that Porges would later name. And what happens next in the psalm is nothing short of a map of how the nervous system moves out of shutdown. From birth I was cast on you. From my mother's womb you have been my God. Explicit memory, the hippocampal kind, with its pastness and its narrative, breaking through the dorsal state. A remembered fact, something that predates the crisis, that the crisis could not erase, that surfaces like a landmark through fog. For he has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. Pause. The movement from shutdown to engagement happens through the recovery of the perception of a present other, not through resolution of the threat. Through the restoration of felt connection, Psalm moves from abandonment to he listened, and with that, the nervous system begins to reorganize, not because the circumstances changed, because the relational context was restored. I want to tell you something about memory that is going to change how you think about healing. For a long time, neuroscience believed that long-term memories were fixed, encoded once, stored, and immune to alteration. The conventional model was that memories were like photographs, once developed, permanent. In the early 2000s, researchers discovered something that overturned this model entirely. They discovered that when a memory is recalled, when it is brought back into active consciousness, it enters a temporary state of instability. For a window of time after recall, the memory is literally malleable. It can be updated. The emotional charge associated with it can be modified. This process is called memory reconsolidation. Pause. What it means is this. Every time you remember something, you are rebuilding it. And during the rebuilding, during that window of reconsolidation, it is possible for the memory to be reconstructed in a different context of safety rather than danger, a context of presence rather than abandonment, context of I am with you rather than I have left you to face this alone. But the nervous system's encoding of what that event means can shift. And what activates the reconsolidation window most powerfully consistently points to the same factor: relational context, felt safety in the presence of a trusted other. Pause. Are you hearing what I am saying? The mechanism by which trauma memories can be updated and healed at the level of neuroscience is the felt experience of safety in the presence of someone who knows what you carry and is not afraid of it. That is not a description of a therapeutic technique. That is a description of what happens in prayer. Psalm 139, verses 13 and 14. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. I want you to hear inmost being differently than you have before, a word that refers to the kidneys, the deepest internal organs, the biological interior. In Hebrew anthropology, the kilea was the seat of the emotional life, not the mind, not the heart in the metaphorical sense, but the visceral interior, the gut. the nervous system. God created your nervous system, the amygdala that fires, the hippocampus that encodes memory, the dorsal state that protects you by making you invisible to yourself. He made all of it. And He made it, the Psalm says, wonderfully. In Hebrew, Nora, meaning in a way that inspires reverence. That stops you. That makes the person who looks at it closely enough say, there is something here that could not have happened by accident. Pause. Your trauma response did not break something God made perfect. Your trauma response is something God made. A protection system so sophisticated, so responsive, so precisely tuned that every neuroscientist who has spent a career studying it cannot fully describe it. You are not broken. You are a person designed by God, carrying biological patterns that formed to protect a life He had not finished with yet. Lamentations 3, verses 19 through 23. He does not pretend the memory is not there. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. He names it affliction, wandering, bitterness. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Yet, not therefore, despite the full weight of what is remembered, in the same breath as the full catalog of pain, yet, because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for His compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Pause. God took the memories away, not God erased what happened. His compassion is new every morning. Every morning, the reconsolidation window opens. Every morning, the nervous system has another opportunity to encode this session in the presence of a God who is here, who is safe, who does not flinch at what you carry. Every morning is a new opportunity for the body to learn something it has not yet fully learned, that the thing which happened. It is real. It is past. And you are not in it anymore. In the present. In the presence of the one who was present then and has not moved since. Father, for the person who came to this session carrying something they have been carrying for a very long time. Something they may have never said out loud to another person, something that lives in the body rather than the mind, and therefore has been immune to all the advice that was only aimed at the mind. I do not ask you to make it as if it never happened. I ask for something more specific and more possible. I ask that right now, in this moment, the reconsolidation window would open, that the memory, in whatever form it lives in this body, would meet the present context of your presence. That the nervous system would encode something new. This is what it is like to carry this wound and be held at the same time. I ask that every session like this one would add another layer of safety, another encoding, another morning where your compassions are new. In Jesus' name, who carried wounds into resurrection and showed them still present in His glorified body, wounds that did not disqualify Him, wounds that became the proof of what He had endured and survived. Let this person know that their wounds do not disqualify them either. They are evidence of a life that has not stopped. Amen. I will see you tomorrow.